Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for part two of our second part of our NAFTA festival this quarter. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute. Just before our lunch break, we had a fascinating speech and then discussion with John Hamre, president of the Center for Strategic International Studies, and talking about the security aspects of trade and the U.S. interest and the idea that not only Asia, but Mexico and our other allies want the U.S. there, but not with military boots, with imported shoes. I think it's important for us to stop for a moment. Roughly 100 years ago, General Pershing of the U.S. Army was following various so-called revolutionary forces into Mexico, and that's what qualified him to go off and lead the U.S. Army in World War I. John Hamre stood up here and said he had not been to Mexico City until just this past year. Now, if you think about the fact that a longtime U.S. defense expert, someone who was Undersecretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary of Defense, chair of the President's Advisory Panel on Defense, could go a 30-year career without having to go to Mexico, that tells you something. That tells you that we are not in the era of 1905 or 1917, and part of that is because, not all of it by any means, but part of that is because we have developed a healthy, mutually respectful economic relationship with Mexico. And so we are going to move on from the security issues now to additional key critical issues that go beyond the narrow trade. But again, I encourage my friends, particularly on the left, who tend to poo-poo the national security arguments, to think twice before they do so. I'm about to introduce our second panel, but I want to remind people that today, which is Made in America Great Super Duper Day, according to the Trump White House, the U.S. Trade Representative is supposed to file with Congress their statement of goals for the negotiations in NAFTA. Hasn't yet appeared. Chad, you're monitoring Twitter. Has it yet appeared? Has not yet appeared. So I would like to tell all those people on Capitol Hill and all those lawyers on K Street who are wondering what the negotiation goals of the United States would be, I would suggest they read A Path Forward for NAFTA, released today by the Peterson Institute, which tells you what those goals should be in a practical sense and in a meaningful sense. And as part of that, we now turn to our distinguished panel on the broader issues of NAFTA. I had mentioned at the start of today there were issues of NAFTA being oversold and undersold, but one of the very real and legitimate claims about NAFTA is in the changing economic and political context of the last 25 years, such issues as human rights, the environment, energy, these have become very important parts of our public demand on what a trade policy should include. And we have a constructive agenda, a positive agenda for how NAFTA can be adapted in that way. So we're going to have four speakers following our usual format. I'm going to introduce them all, let them come through and cycle, and then we will have them up here to take questions on the record. Speaking first will be our colleague Chad Bown, who joined the Peterson Institute just a year ago, April, but has had a profound impact here and throughout Washington since. He previously served as senior economist for international trade and investment at the CEA and at the World Bank as a lead economist conducting research and advising developing country governments. Previously was a tenured professor of economics at Brandeis, and I am delighted that he made the move to forsake a pure academic career for the kind of influence, the positive influence he's having. He will be addressing Trump administration's treatment of U.S. trade laws and how some of the things that are going on right now might backfire in the negotiations with Canada and Mexico. Speaking second, coming from our partners, CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, is Patrick Leblond, who's a senior fellow with the Global Economy Program at CIGI. He's also an associate professor and CN Paul M. Teller Chair on Business and Public Policy at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. I had to read that to make sure I got every word. He's previously taught at HEC Montreal and University of Montreal. He has been an accountant, including as an auditor at our friends Ernst & Young. But most of all, he's someone who's being very forward-looking about thinking on the broader issues from cybersecurity to human rights that today's kinds of modernized trade agreements must include, and we're drawing on his past research for today's presentation. Third, will be speaking a distinguished, very old friend of the Institute who started out as a young friend of the Institute, not that long after NAFTA was signed. Dan Esty is the Hillhouse Professor of Environmental Law and Policy at Yale since 1994. He directs the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. He was also Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection from 2011 to 2014. He, in fact, was a senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute, then the Institute for International Economics in the early 90s, and has been an advisor and occasional author on these issues for us. He will be presenting his unique perspective on environment and trade rules as NAFTA moves forward. And finally, the alpha and the omega of trade policy, Gary Clyde Hufbauer, will speak. People may get sick of my singing Gary's praises, but it's hard to overdo sell that. Gary is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow here at the Institute, the first of our endowed chairs since 1992, has previously been Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Marcus Wallenberg Professor of International Finance and Diplomacy at Georgetown. He, of course, is the critical person at the nexus of law, trade, practical trade remedies, economic modeling of their effects, and, of course, has an ongoing interest in energy since the days of NAFTA's beginning, and he'll be speaking to us about those issues as well. Thank you for bearing with my long introduction. We're very proud to have such a distinguished panel. Let me first turn to Chad Bown.
Thank you for the introduction, Adam. I'm going to set my timer here for 12 minutes because that's as long as I can be away from Twitter without having to check for what's going on with the NAFTA objectives that we're waiting for today. So what I'm going to talk about today is trade laws, so thinking about anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards, and the like, and how this fits into the Trump administration's approach to renegotiation of NAFTA, but really thinking about this in the context of what it is that they've done so far, and in particular in light of what they did over their first 100 days of being in office. And we have a new clicker, so I'm going to try to make it work. And you got to point in the right direction. Okay, so the question came up in the last section, non-tariff barriers. That's what we're talking about here, non-tariff barriers, use of trade laws like anti-dumping, countervailing duties. So to talk about this in the NAFTA context, we really need to go back to the 1980s and even the early 1980s, because this was a very important point, especially for the Canadians in the first free trade agreement negotiations with the United States, so the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And the reason why was Canada found itself caught up in the 1970s, 1980s. Canada's exporters found themselves caught up in a lot of U.S. anti-dumping actions that were affecting their trade. So I've listed a number of cases where they were targeted, products like exports to the U.S. in sugar, chloride, raspberries, codfish, but they were also caught up in a number of multi-country disputes. So we think back to the 1980s, there were lots of cases on metal products, steel, brass, things like that, where even though Canada may not have been the main target of these cases in these multi-country disputes, as an exporter, it was going to get lumped in with accumulation with a lot of other countries in Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the Europeans at the time. So Canada, when it was negotiating the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement originally, really wanted to have anti-dumping, countervailing duties, the anti-subsidy unfair trade law in the United States, they wanted to be exempt from that, right? So they pushed as strongly as they possibly could to try to get the United States to not apply trade remedies to their trade as part of the trade agreement. Now, the United States was not willing to go that far, so the compromise was the establishment in first the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, but then ultimately in NAFTA of this thing called Chapter 19. So it's a special dispute resolution process to look at where basically the exporters, typically in these cases, can challenge one of the other NAFTA countries' use of anti-dumping CVD on their trade. Okay, so it's sort of a special expedited review process to look into those sorts of import restrictions that are being imposed. Okay, so as an economist then I say, well, has this had an impact? And I'm not going to claim that this is causal by any sense, but what I thought I would do is put up a chart. And for those of you that have suffered through one of my presentations over the last couple of months, you'll see that this has some similarities. The red line, so this is the share of U.S. imports that are sitting under trade remedies each year. So the stock of import restrictions under anti-dumping law, countervailing duty law. And the red line, of course, is China, right? So we know essentially since China's introduction into the WTO, 2001, about 1% of U.S. imports from China back in 2000 were subject to anti-dumping, countervailing duty. Nowadays, it's up near almost 10%, so 9 and a bit percent, right? And so under anti-dumping law, you've got special provisions, non-market economy treatment to deal with China. That's the red line there. The black line is the rest of the world, and the blue line at the bottom is the intra-NAFTA imports, so the imports coming in from Canada and Mexico. And what you see over this time period is that U.S. use of anti-dumping, countervailing duties against Canada and Mexico in particular was very, very low. By the end of the period, so by 2016, the very beginning of the Trump administration, only 1.3% of U.S. imports are from Canada and Mexico, right? So 1.3% of bilateral or NAFTA trade imports coming in from those two countries are subject to these kinds of import restrictions. Much lower than for the rest of the world and certainly much lower than China. The only real spike that you see in the blue line there, at least during this time period, is 2001 to 2006, where we had softwood lumber, right? An episode where we had import restrictions on softwood lumber from Canada. And that's really the big case. Sorry, I didn't mention that in my first slide, and that's obviously a crucial one as well. And it's come back today, and so I'll get back to that. Okay, so that's the United States' use of anti-dumping countervailing duties against Canada and Mexico. How about the other countries? Well, Canada's picture looks relatively similar, just the levels are lower. So Canada also tends to use more anti-dumping against China, but whereas at the end of the U.S. 2016 period, it was about 9% of U.S. imports from China were subject to these import restrictions. In Canada, it's only about 3%, so a much lower level. Still, China's the number one target, just a much lower level. But also, it too doesn't really use anti-dumping CVDs against the other NAFTA partners. By 2016, only 0.1% of Canada's imports from the U.S. and Mexico were subject to these kinds of import restrictions. Okay, so not affecting a huge amount of imports from us or Mexico, and the same things sort of from Mexico. Mexico's a slightly different story, and it's worth talking about because it's very interesting. The red line, the China line from Mexico's perspective, Mexico actually imposed a massive set of anti-dumping import restrictions on China back in 1992, 1993, covering essentially 20% of their product lines, or about 40% of their imports at the time coming in from China. And those import restrictions, anti-dumping import restrictions set at very, very high levels on toys and bicycles and clothing, basically lasted for 15 years. They stayed on until 2008. And in the height of the economic crisis in October of 2008, Mexico still took them off, right? So that's what the red line, the downward sloping line there is. They were on for a long time, but they got taken off, and they haven't gone back on since. By the end of the period, only 1.7% of Mexico's imports from China subject to these kinds of import restrictions, 1.3% of imports from NAFTA partners. Not a huge deal, right? So when you look at these charts and the data, it's not a lot of use of anti-dumping countervailing duties against these countries. Of course, these aren't the only trade laws that we're going to talk about and that could potentially be used, and especially if we remember back to 2001, 2002, under the George W. Bush administration, like we're seeing today, there was global overcapacity in steel. There was a massive set of import restrictions, not under anti-dumping countervailing duty law, but under this Section 201 law, the global safeguard law. But in that particular instance, and in other instances in which the United States has used that law, it actually excluded imports coming in from Canada and Mexico from from the duties being applied. So there were 30% import tariffs applied against steel coming in from Japan, China, Europe, but not Canada and Mexico. They were exempted, right? That's not a mandatory provision of the agreement on safeguards under the WTO. Countries can kind of do it either way, but the United States has traditionally exempted NAFTA partners. But of course that could change, right? We don't know. We're going to talk about this. But the last question I'll ask of the data then is this one here on the bottom. What are they doing towards imports from third countries? Is there any sort of evidence that these things are tending to work together? So I thought I would throw up one chart. I hadn't looked at this previously. So this is looking at Canada. So this is Canada's import restrictions under anti-dumping countervailing duty law first. So this is, by the end of 2016, about 1.6% or so of imports from non-NAFTA partners, from China, from Europe, from Japan, Korea, et cetera, were subject to these import restrictions. Okay, so this is just to establish your baseline. How much overlap, we might ask, is there with what the United States is doing? So when Canada imposes import restrictions on stuff coming in from Europe or Japan, does the United States do it too or not? And what we see over time is the United States tends to do it too. So back in 1994, at the beginning of the NAFTA period, there was very little overlap. Only 40% of the products in which Canada had import restrictions from non-NAFTA partners did the United States also have import restrictions from non-NAFTA partners. By the end of the period, 85%. So in a sense, even though it's not a customs union, right, even though there's no common external trade party toward third countries, this sort of seems to be happening in some sense, right? And so we can look at specific cases under anti-dumping law and stuff coming in from China. You look imports of mattress inner spring units, OCTG, or country tubular goods, steel grating. The United States starts a case, then within months, against the same trading partner, the same exact product, Canada does the same thing, right? And we're starting to see some of that in steel as well. So what's the economics behind this? Does this sort of activity make sense? And I would argue that yes, with the integration of NAFTA, you would sort of expect this kind of activity to take place. You see, first of all, a lot of common ownership between Canadian firms and American firms. Sometimes these laws or provisions are triggered by labor unions, and sometimes there's national cross-border integration of labor unions, as we're seeing with United Steelworkers, et cetera. And then obviously they're exposed to common shocks, right? The China shock in particular, import surges coming in certain products from a similar foreign source. And I think the contemporary example of today, the North American steel industry, you look at companies, ArcelorMittal, Evra, Tenaris, SAB, right? These are all steel companies that have plants in both markets, domestic plants in both Canada and the United States. The United Steelworkers represents them, and they face the same common concern, which is this overcapacity problem that stems from some of it from China. Okay, but the summary of the NAFTA experience is these countries haven't used anti-dumping countervailing duties safeguards much against each other. They're increasingly applying it toward third countries in a way that looks somewhat similar. So you say, what's the problem, right? Why would this be a topic of negotiation under NAFTA? So voila, right? And that's the limit of my French Canadian for today. The first 100 days of the Trump administration, we see massive use of US trade laws. So under anti-dumping countervailing duty, we saw a continuation of the softwood lumber case, which was started under the Obama administration in December. That's fine, but it's continued. Sugar from Mexico, these national security cases, steel and aluminum, and then a couple of global safeguard cases, the solar cell and washing machines. So the Trump administration has not only embraced traditional trade laws, anti-dumping countervailing duties, but expanded that to use the national security exception, this Section 232. And we've seen new global safeguard cases, the first one since the Bush administration of 2001. We've seen the first two of those. So what are the implications of that? So if they are to actually impose import restrictions under all the cases that they've got up until now, or at least through the first 100 days or so, we would see a major increase in the share of imports being affected by these sorts of trade barriers, right? And a little bit on China. Remember, the first chart I showed said 9% or so of US imports from China are subject to these import restrictions. That would go up to about 11%. But a big target of these things is Canada and Mexico, right? So it's really critical how Canada and Mexico are ultimately going to be treated in these types of cases. And this is just a chart showing each of the big ones that we're seeing so far. Steel, if they just did across-the-board tariffs say of 25% on all imports of steel and didn't exclude Canada and Mexico, steel is basically 3% of Canada's exports to the U.S., 2% of Mexico's exports to the U.S. Aluminum is 2.5% of Canada's exports to the U.S. Softwood lumber, 2.5%. You add these things up, and all of a sudden, that very first chart, where very little NAFTA trade was affected by U.S. import restrictions, all of a sudden, a lot of NAFTA trade. About 9% of Canada's exports to the United States would suddenly become subject to these import restrictions. Canada would become like China in terms of its exposure to being hit by U.S. import restrictions under these trade laws. Okay, so what this means is, while we hadn't really heard too much about Chapter 19, this process of resolving disputes under the NAFTA that come up through anti-dumping countervailing duty laws, I think we can expect to see it now, right? The Trump administration's actions and active use of these laws have likely raised the attention of officials in Ottawa and Mexico City and said, especially the Trump administration has came out and said, we want to get rid of Chapter 19 altogether. On the other hand, this is likely to really make officials in other capitals say, no, these are now more important than ever for us. If you're going to actively be using these laws, we want to make sure that we have mechanisms to really try to make sure that they're not going to impact us much at all. And then I'll conclude with this. So the Trump administration's early and aggressive actions under U.S. trade laws, in particular the national security exception, really has trading partners concerned. Obviously, one way of referring to this is the nuclear option of trade law. Once you go down this path, you can sort of justify any kind of import restriction as being a threat to national security without really exception, and it opens up a huge Pandora's box. The Trump administration has self-initiated its own cases, the aluminum and steel cases. We think that we can envision macroeconomic conditions changing in a way that may make it more likely for these cases to continue in the future. So I would expect in the NAFTA renegotiations for Canada and Mexico to really push quite strongly, and not only to perhaps want to retain the current version of Chapter 19, but perhaps to expand it, right? Right now it just covers anti-dumping and countervailing duties. They're going to say, well, the United States, if you're using Section 232, you're going to more actively use Section 201, the global safeguard. We want to make sure that we're carved out from those things as well, or we've got some sort of expedited procedures to deal with our interests there. And then finally, as the economist in all of this, one potential concern that I have, and we don't need to talk too much about this, is does this kind of create some perverse incentives where if you can't use these sorts of trade barriers on intra-free trade agreement trade, that sort of pushes the protection that would otherwise occur to want you to raise additional protection on outsiders, right, to all of our non-FTA partners out there in the world. So that's something I'd be a little bit concerned about. And then finally, there is this last concern of, is there the potential for returning back to the 1980s, where one of the big concerns with use about anti-dumping in particular was the concern over the segmentation of markets. And, would there be trade for the North American region, but would be separated from trade from Europe, from Asia, because basically there was sort of an implicit world of collusion with firms using these laws like anti-dumping. So an abuse of that could lead to that kind of scenario as well. So lots to watch out for. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for the red on the black. This is the CIGI template. I'm not sure how easy it is to look, especially given the light coming, but hopefully it will make sense. So as Adam said, I'm here to talk to you about kind of the new issues that we could see or hope to see in a what I call a modernized NAFTA. I think my starting point is that if the whole point of the negotiations is to make NAFTA more protectionist, if it's to reduce trade and investment between the North American partners, then why not just keep the status quo? And certainly this is what I would expect the Canadians and the Mexicans to do if here there is no willingness to actually improve the agreement, but make it more protectionist in the sense that just the Chad just mentioned. And I would not be surprised then if the negotiations drag out, hoping maybe for a more, let's say, understanding administration in the U.S. when it comes to negotiations. So what I want to talk about, and I guess I also need to learn how to use this. Whoa. Okay. The bottom one. Sorry. Yeah, I'm already done. Thanks.
No, thank you, Pat.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to come and talk to you and provide a Canadian perspective on NAFTA. So there are basically three issues that I want to talk to you about. They're not the only important issues in terms of kind of the add-ons as opposed to what's already there, which, as far as I understand, was covered by the previous workshop that was held in June. I want to talk about e-commerce. I want to talk about regulatory cooperation, and also talk about gender and human rights in terms of these more positive, or in Canada we call them progressive aspects. There's a whole, I don't know here if that language has made it to the US, but certainly in Europe and Canada now the whole thing is about progressive trade. So I guess here it's still positive. So progressive is positive. So in terms of e-commerce, certainly when NAFTA was negotiated, came into force, it was only the start of the idea that maybe we could trade things over the internet. In fact, most people did not really know what the internet was. Email was just started. I think no one had heard of Netscape back in 1993. I only heard of Netscape in 1995. So this whole idea of e-commerce did not exist, and certainly there's no reference to it in NAFTA. But now it's a major part of our lives, and the big issue is really between, as certainly we've seen in the China case, between security, privacy, individual data, personal information, but also the free flow of information and data, and even electronic services, right? So how to find sort of the right balance between this? For instance, in Canada, there are a few provinces that require that companies that do business with their governments should have their servers in that province for privacy concerns that the data might be sent to the United States for that matter. And here the real question is, well, to what extent can the justifications for security and privacy can be used to either block trade altogether. We see it in China, where many websites or electronic e-trade businesses cannot operate in China unless they have their own servers. Apple was the last company to announce that they were basically transferring their old data centers into China. But that is actually an increased cost of business. It's a limitation on the free flow of data information. And how do we prevent that, especially when it comes to a point where, again, going back to the nuclear option, where security concerns trump everything, and we limit, in a way, the trade and the electronic activities that now are so important and are likely to become even more important in the future. So certainly that's an element that NAFTA should include. And the way I've come at this is to say, well, what can we look for in terms of creating a new chapter, let's say on e-commerce within NAFTA for the negotiators, and most likely the people who've negotiated the TPP are likely going to be the same negotiators, or very, at least a larger number of them will be the same negotiators who will be sitting in that room renegotiating NAFTA. And I could just see them come and say, okay, well, we have this TPP, chapter that we've negotiated on e-commerce. Maybe we should just kind of transpose it. We all agreed on it, all of us. So why not just transpose it? And to me, that seems that it would be the thing that makes the most sense. The chapter on e-commerce, on digital trade in the TPP is considered the most advanced of the agreements that are out there, the so-called kind of third generation agreements. It even goes beyond the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement that Canada and the EU have signed. So it's kind of a natural fit. And it addresses a lot of these issues. And you know, as mentioned, it covers even cooperation on a range of e-commerce related issues, because you know, another important thing is that one of the criticisms of NAFTA is that it's kind of a static agreement, right? It was negotiated in the 1990s, but it has not really evolved since, and it has no real mechanisms for evolving. So what we should also try to do is build in mechanisms within a revised NAFTA or modernized NAFTA so that it actually can continue evolving on regulatory issues in terms of e-commerce, but others. And that's where I'll move on to the regulatory cooperation. But already here, there is that kind of language. And then also the issue is making sure that we have the proper mechanisms for dealing with the possibility of using privacy or security concerns to block the free flow of data and information and ideas. And TPP is certainly a good starting point to do so. So I'm kind of just here covering the elements. I know some of you have the paper that I did with my colleague Judith Fabian for CIGI on modernizing NAFTA, and there we go into much more details about these issues. So here is kind of giving you the quick version. Regulatory cooperation. I mean, we've talked about NTBs, non-tariff barriers. More and more, these are the obstacles to trade nowadays. You know, it's regulations, it's standards. It's not so much the tariffs. I don't know what the percentages is of, you know, small and medium-sized businesses in North America that do not use the you know, tariff preferences within NAFTA because the rules of origins are too complicated. So it's not so much, you know, they prefer to use the 5% or 6% tariff, MFN tariff, than to get the free trade because it's too costly to fill out the paperwork, to get the analyses done. It's just not worth it. So how many other issues like that are just transaction costs for business to deal with when it comes to regulations? You know, we have the lady from Toyota. You know, it'd be nice, you know, you build a car, it's good for all three countries. Well, in some cases it happens, but in some cases it doesn't. You got to change this, you got to change that. And yes, you know, if you can drive a car in the US, why can't you drive it in Canada and vice versa? Right? Why should we have, you know, different cars coming out with, you know, small differences? Because they add up ultimately, and the consumer pays. And you know, so we need to have this regulatory cooperation. The Security and Prosperity Partnership between the three countries wanted to do that. Unfortunately, the political momentum died, and no one talks about the Security and Prosperity Partnership. Then it's been revised to some extent on a bilateral basis. We now have these regulatory cooperation councils, US and Canada, US and Mexico, but still they're not very formal, right? They could die very quickly if there is no political momentum. So again, the way I see it is that they should be integrated within NAFTA. There should actually be not only in specific issues where you outline the kinds of cooperation mechanisms that should exist, but even more broadly a chapter on regulatory cooperation. So Adam is telling me that I should hurry up. I will. And certainly if we want to keep a more bilateral issue, then it should be also, there should be some kind of federal aspect to it to make sure that there is coordination. All right, gender and human rights. A lot of people think, okay, well, you know, why should we talk about gender and human rights within trade agreements? And there's a debate there. Certainly, some people think that that's asking too much of free trade agreements, right? We should not talk about these things. We should limit them. But on the other hand, there are people who say, well, you know, we don't have a lot of means to have human rights and gender issues being respected, and trade agreements are one where we can actually push things forward. We can get other countries to increase their standards on these issues. Certainly, when it comes to labor rights, I mean, this was a side agreement to NAFTA that, in a way, was beneficial to help Mexico upgrade, if you want, its standards in terms of the treatment of workers. And that's the kind of logic that applies here. Some might say, well, you know, this would be mostly for Mexico, not so much between Canada and the US. But still, it sends a very strong message not on, to the rest of the world. I think, the way we should approach this modernization of NAFTA should be the same way that NAFTA was approached before, which is to make it the best agreement out there that can be a model for the rest of the world. And NAFTA was a model for the rest of the world in the 1990s, not anymore. People are looking at the TPP, people are looking at CETA, but I think, in my view, this is how, again, if we want to talk about leadership, this is how the three North American countries, especially the US, should be looking at NAFTA and certainly inserting more language in terms of human rights, in terms of gender. Certainly trade can have negative effect for these things, whether it's, in some countries, small farmers losing their jobs, many of them can be owned by women. So how do we address that in making, in a way, trade also fair? Because nowadays we know there's a huge backlash against free trade. So if we, again, can bring that language and saying, well, no, we do have mechanisms for dealing with the people who are the losing end of free trade, then that might help make it easier to sell. And in that case, I just wanted to, as there is little time, I want to show you CETA, which in a way is again, considered a progressive agreement, and certainly this is the way that Canada and the EU have negotiated it, where they have in the preamble, of course, they reaffirm their strong attachment to democracy and fundamental rights, as laid down in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the importance of human rights in terms of trade and development and economic cooperation, even when it comes to investment and cross-border trade and services. Human rights can be used as a reason, as a legitimate reason for the denial of benefits, to say, you know what, we will not accept your investment, even though it satisfies Chapter 8 of CETA. If a company is not respecting human rights, or even, is discriminating against women or something like that, that could be a basis for Canada to say, no, we will refuse your investment in Canada. We will refuse the ability for your firm to provide services in Canada. So that has become a reason for the denial of benefits. And certainly such language could be improved. Now, even in terms of national security, human rights could be a reason for denying benefits or provide, including some kinds of safeguards. And certainly we've seen this in terms of sanctions. So I think I'm out of time. Certainly there's even more language in terms of this, but in the context of gender, should we include the Canada-US Council for Advancements of Women Entrepreneurs and Business Leaders that in a way was launched when Prime Minister Trudeau came here? Should that be part of NAFTA? Should there be some kind of cooperation mechanism to deal with these issues, bring them to the North American level, and see how we can improve the lots of women, of minorities, of other groups who that may not benefit as much from free trade as other groups. And that's something that it's a type of conversations and discussion that needs to happen. So now I can finally say thank you.
Again, I'm Dan Esty from Yale, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Adam, in particular, for inviting me back to the Institute. It really is a pleasure to be here reflecting on the work I did 25 years ago, both in negotiating the environmental provisions of NAFTA and then writing the first of my books, sitting right here at the Peterson Institute. And I do want to start by taking you back 25 years as we think about the trade and environment agenda. 25 years ago, this month, I was just back from the Rio Earth Summit. And at that Rio Earth Summit, a number of things got done, but perhaps for purposes of today, what was most notable was that the concept of sustainable development got locked in as part of the global policy agenda. Prior to that moment, there had been conversations. The concept had been kind of launched a few years earlier by something called the Brundtland Commission, a UN commission formerly called Our Common Future. And the idea was that we needed to have a more integrated policy framework that brought environmental dimensions into and connected them to the economic growth agenda, the development agenda. And it was a critical breakthrough as a way to get North and South, developed and developing worlds, to work together on a set of problems, acknowledging the importance to the developing world of economic growth, but acknowledging for the developed world the importance of addressing a whole set of environmental concerns. Also at that Rio Earth Summit, we finalized and signed, had presidents and prime ministers sign, including then President H.W. Bush, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is interesting to be here 25 years later, after a relatively slow set of decades of progress on climate change, but a relatively strong consolidation of sustainable development as a core element of global policy. But both of those big issues, climate change and the sustainable development focus, have recently been solidified in international commitments, notably the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement, which, by the way, makes reference to sustainable development. So it is now seen as a framework concept for the 21st century. And then separately, but also in 2015, the UN agreed on a set of sustainable development goals, SDGs, 17 of them, with 100 plus underlying metrics to gauge progress. So we now do have this concept of sustainable development very much front and center, and I think it is important to see that as a fundamental starting point for any NAFTA renegotiation, and frankly, for any dimension of international economic cooperation. And I also just want to pause for a moment and say thank you to a couple of folks in the audience. Fred Bergston brought me to the Institute 25 years ago as a 33-year-old guy who'd never written a book, and said, tell us, how should we think about trade and environment? And that allowed me to produce my first book, first of what is now 10, called Greening the GATT. And I also want to thank Gary Hufbauer and Jeff Schott, who sat here as I was here for a couple of years and pushed me to think in a careful way about how environment should be folded into the trade agenda, and to think in a careful way about how the trade agenda affected the environment. And it was their push to be careful, systematic, and analytically rigorous that allows me to look back and say, that book wasn't so bad. I'm pretty pleased with what I said. And I thank them for saving me from errors that I might otherwise have put into the volume and be embarrassed about as I stand before you 25 years later. But I do think this is one of the things that the Peterson Institute is known for and should be celebrated for. And that is careful, thoughtful, systematic, economically rigorous, but beyond economic rigor, thought about how policy should be structured. And it is that which I think we should celebrate here 25 years on. But let me just focus for a minute on what is in the NAFTA when it comes to environment and where it might go. First, again, going back to our mindset 25 years ago, there was a panic in the environmental community because they thought we're integrating our economy with a developing country and there's going to be a huge flow of cheap goods produced under poor environmental conditions coming into the United States. So environmentalists were panicked. Their panic doubled because there was a GATT decision called the tuna dolphin case that seemed to suggest where trade and environment issues came into conflict, trade principles would trump. But there was equal panic, I might add, about bringing a focus on environment into the negotiations. The trade core, the traditional trade community, thought, oh my God, don't weigh down our difficult job of bringing about a trade agreement with all of your crazy environmental stuff. It's a separate issue, a separate conversation, keep it in a separate place. We did not do that. We brought these together. There was an environmental team that was part of the negotiations. There are environmental elements in the NAFTA, as well as a side agreement that was then added on later by the Clinton administration. The core concern, from an environmental point of view, that trade would override environmental issues, energy concerns as well, perhaps, was addressed in a number of express ways in the NAFTA agreement. First and foremost, the language of prior GATT decisions that said policies had to be selected in a way that was least inconsistent with GATT obligations was softened. So we wrote into the NAFTA language that said there would be regulatory flexibility for the three NAFTA parties, so long as the policies chosen were equally effective and reasonably available as the alternatives that might have been the least trade inconsistent. So a softening of the language to give more scope for regulation. There was also a provision, section 1114, on pollution havens, so that there wouldn't be this worry of companies uplifting their Canadian or US operations and moving them to Mexico just to get lighter environmental standards. And it turns out that there were several other provisions, including one saying that international environmental agreements should be respected and naming some agreements that should be seen as coming prior to any of the trade liberalization of NAFTA. And all of that package has produced almost no controversy. 25 years, and the fear from the trade side that this would be deeply disruptive has not unfolded. What has become controversial was Chapter 11, the investor state dispute resolution mechanism, which has been seen as a potential sword to poke the regulatory standards of the three NAFTA countries on allowing private businesses to push for better regulatory treatment. And that is seen as constraining regulatory sovereignty. And as I'll come back to, that is a provision that probably needs some rethinking in the context of NAFTA renegotiation. I also want to say that the institutional mechanisms set up to try to bring a focus to environment issues systematically over time, the Commission on Environmental Cooperation in particular, this is a small intergovernmental body, three-country body based in Montreal, has proven to be somewhat disappointing. It's been underfunded, understaffed, has not delivered on the full promise that I think was hoped for when it was launched. Having said that, there are two other institutional elements, North American Bank and a Border Environmental Cooperation Commission, that have done better, have actually been able to structure mechanisms to flow about $7 billion worth of border infrastructure into getting funded and getting built, particularly infrastructure like wastewater treatment systems, drinking water systems that address environmental concerns. So, mixed story on the institutions. How does this add up from an environmental impact point of view? For those who are interested in the details, there are some charts in the chapter that is in my chapter 10 of the volume that's being published online today, so please feel free to go look online. But in summary, there were and have been and continue to be some of what we call scale effects. As the economic growth, particularly in Mexico, created more industrial activity, there are some sectors where pollution levels have gone up. Overall, however, emissions in Mexico and across North America have come down, in part because all three countries have had very significant commitments to the environmental agenda that their societies were demanding and asking for. And the reductions have been biggest in Mexico, which was 25 years ago underdeveloped in its capacity for pollution control and environmental management more broadly, and has benefited enormously from the link to Canada and the United States. The amount of capacity building that has gone on is significant. There are every day and every year collaborations across the Mexican Environment Ministry, with the Canadian Environment Ministry, and with the US EPA, and those have dramatically improved Mexico's ability to deliver on its own environmental agenda for its own people. And as a result, there is much better waste management in Mexico. A much higher percent of the population has access to safe drinking water, to modern sanitation. So the suggestion that somehow NAFTA has done little on the environment, or perhaps moved us in the wrong direction, not upheld, not correct. So we really do have to understand, and I think it's a theme that's emerging here today, that the NAFTA has delivered results. Perhaps not splashy, and perhaps not as big as some had hoped for, and maybe not as big as some had promised, but the trend lines are going in the right direction, and I add to that story the environmental trend lines. So let me turn now to where we need to go in a renegotiation, in my mind, from an environmental point of view, or perhaps we should now call it from a sustainable development point of view or a sustainability point of view. First, I do think that the world community has come to believe that sustainability is a framework concept for the 21st century, and that we need to have sustainability embedded in all international economic cooperation efforts. It has been ratified now multiple times in the international community, again, most recently and vividly as part of the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015 and of the commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. In that regard, I would argue that a renegotiation process should begin with a sustainable development impact analysis or a sustainability impact analysis. And this would be an opportunity to look at potential points of tension where environmental issues and economic goals might clash, and thinking systematically about how to address them, where the economic growth anticipated and encouraged by freer trade might create pollution problems or resource stresses that could be, through good policy, managed in a better rather than a worse way. And I think that kind of an analysis is now being done in a lot of places. Europe has a model for this, and I think it would be an excellent starting point for a NAFTA renegotiation. Third, I think we can add to the list of international environmental agreements that are in the NAFTA, the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, as two additional important international statements of environmental commitment that should be, in effect, protected within the context of expanded North American trade and the commitments, the recommitments that might come through in a renegotiated NAFTA. Number four, as I mentioned, I think it's time to relook at Chapter 11, the Investor State Dispute Resolution provision, and rethink that in a way that is more careful about providing regulatory flexibility to the three NAFTA parties. I think in this regard, and again, this is a theme emerging, that the TPP provides a model. The TPP language in Article 9.16 is a pretty good starting point for providing regulatory flexibility within a context that says that flexibility must be used in a non-discriminatory way and in a way that is pursuing legitimate public welfare objectives. Though those are the core tests for a regulatory decision, it's not subject to the idea that any regulation should be the least trade inconsistent available, because that sets, as I mentioned earlier, too high a bar and has proven to be disruptive as a way to bring trade and environmental goals together rather than supportive. Number five, I think it would be useful to have a commitment in a renegotiated NAFTA to ongoing institutional focus, working together, but perhaps with a slightly enhanced commitment to transparency, to data, to reporting, to indicators of environmental progress or deterioration, so that there is a framework for ongoing review and updating if environmental stresses are getting worse. This is, by the way, another element of what we today, 25 years from the original NAFTA, know is good policy. It's good policy in the environmental domain, but it's good policy more broadly, to be more fact-based, empirical, and data-driven. And we have a much greater capacity today than 25 years ago to manage that data and to make it work to policymakers' advantage. So let me close by saying that I think what was done 25 years ago in the NAFTA was a pretty good starting point when it comes to bringing environment and trade together. We can improve on it, and should, in the context of a renegotiation, but we should do that improvement in a careful, thoughtful, serious, systematic way that retains a focus on the dual agenda of trade liberalization and environmental protection, or now sustainability, and do so in a way that I think, again, the Peterson Institute has championed for a very long time. I want to close by saying that the real opportunity here, in many regards, to provide, in the context of a renegotiated NAFTA, further progress on integrating trade and environmental agendas is really going to come by rethinking environmental policy. We have an opportunity, I think, going forward, and perhaps a special opportunity over the next couple of years, not to throw environmental regulation out willy-nilly, not to defund the EPA, but rather to think about a revised framework of environmental regulation for the 21st century. It emphasizes much less in the way of command and control mandates from government, much more in the way of price signals, of making people pay for their environmental harms. Mexico and Canada are both moving forward with carbon charges, making those that produce in their countries pay for their greenhouse gas emissions. Countries all over the world are doing that, including some of the people that are really the target of this administration's trade agenda. China is putting in a price signal on greenhouse gas emissions. So it may well be the United States is lagging soon in not having price tools to address environmental harms. And I think that is a worry. So I hope that we, in addition to working in a systematic way on the trade and environment integration, have a separate and important conversation going on about bringing into the 21st century our environmental regulatory model more broadly. Again, away from command and control mandates, towards price signals, and frankly, away from a structure, and this is the core of the 20th century environmental regulatory framework, of red lights, of stop signs, of telling people what they can't do, to an equal commitment to green lights, to incentives that draw the business community in particular into the process of problem solving to deliver the technologies and other activities we need to solve environmental problems. And I'm thinking in this regard in particular, and this is the tee up for Gary, of clean energy. It is absolutely critical that we have the business community playing a role in innovating to deliver the clean energy future that we know we need as the core concern from an environmental perspective. And I think we've done far too little to provide that incentive framework, those green lights to the business community, steering them towards the problems that we'd like from a societal point of view to have solved. So let's think broadly as we push this agenda forward, not only about the integration of the trade and elements like environment, but also what it says more fundamentally about how the regulatory framework should be constructed for the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Adam, and all the preceding speakers, and especially thanks to Regent Young, who helped me with this, worked with me with this, as well as our previous policy brief on what NAFTA means for Canada. I think the good news on energy is whether you see the world from a kind of a Trump perspective or from a more conventional yardstick, energy is a very happy story for the United States and for all three countries. And in that sense, it shares the accolades of agriculture. So for fossil fuels, it's really nothing but good news. For renewable energy, to come back to what Dan just said, it does remain to be seen how the NAFTA partners deal with that. So let's see about this clicker. Well, we got to the conclusion first. That's very good. So here's kind of the picture on trade. And to recall what the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement did, it committed Canada to non-discriminate if it ever restricted energy. Remember, that was a different era with memories of severe shortages. And Canada obligated itself not to be more discriminatory against the United States than it was towards its own users of energy. Well, that world kind of faded away. But if you look at what happened with trade with Canada, the kind of blue line up there on energy, U.S. imports have increased very substantially. But that's not a matter of regret from a kind of Trump type of perspective, because after all, if you didn't import the fossil fuels from Canada, where would they come from? Venezuela, Nigeria, possibly other troubled countries. So then we have the imports from Mexico. Now, unfortunately, Mexico has neglected its fossil fuels, and imports have declined, and we're, I think as Jeff and I wrote quite some time ago, Mexico is on the wrong track with its fossil fuels and is now paying the price. But if you look at the little green line on U.S. exports, which were really quite modest back in 1996, both Mexico and Canada, they're both ticking up. And now for the next slide. I think the Canada story is fairly well known. What I'd like to focus on is the Mexican story for U.S. exports. Mexico is a big taker of refined products from the United States. And given given Pemex's shortage of money because it's used as a piggy bank for the government, et cetera, a story I think everyone knows, there's a huge demand for petrochemicals and other refined products from the United States. And that could be a casualty of a misplaced NAFTA negotiation. But right now, it's all good news. Plus, the natural gas line in shipments to Mexico is fairly thin. It could be much thicker because we have the Texas-Mexico border, fairly friendly to pipelines in both directions, but especially going south. Mexico is quite short on electricity. Natural gas is now currently the cheapest and least environmentally destructive way of producing electricity in volume. So a lot of good things happening on the fossil fuel story. Now, what about the developments since NAFTA? And there have been quite a few. And the most important, perhaps, is the Mexican constitutional reforms. This was very dramatic. I think the history of Mexico and energy and the Rockefellers is well known. And it was at one time well taught in the Mexican school system with kind of an anti-U.S. flavor to it. But there's a different Mexico now. They have, the Nieto government has put through these constitutional reforms which open up the energy sector to foreign investment, private investment, both by Mexicans and foreign firms. And just last week, I read a news story to the effect that one private firm in the Gulf of Mexico came across one of its exploratory wells, seems to have maybe tapped into 1 billion gallons of oil. I mean, it's pretty impressive. So that's the biggest thing, and Mexico is moving ahead. Obviously, if the price of energy suddenly leaps up, which seems quite unlikely, things might move faster, but they're moving. And of course, we have the natural gas from the United States, which I've already touched upon. And there's a quick way for Mexico to increase its electricity production. And we are having an advance of renewable energy, and that is my subject of concern. So the concern, I think the first concern, which is a legitimate one, is that the administration has this concept of Buy American and Hire Americans. I'll leave aside the Hire Americans, but the Buy American part of this agenda, first of all, it contradicts the WTO. Secondly, it contradicts NAFTA. Thirdly, it contradicts good common sense. And it will, if implemented, interfere with the positive things which could happen on the energy front. Because if we're going to do Buy American, why wouldn't Mexico revert to the nationalistic policies that's known in the past? And why wouldn't Canada do the same, which would be exactly the opposite of what they've done, what Canada's done with the Europeans in the CETA agreement, where Canada's opened up the provincial government procurement as well as federal. But with this attitude, I mean, there's all sorts of room for mischief. And recall that that the president not only wants Buy American for government procurement, which I think one of his lieutenants will try to sell to the states, which some of them do anyway, and some more logically open procurement. But he specifically embraced this principle for private procurement on pipelines. Now, I know he's had a waiver on Keystone, a waiver on the Dakota pipeline, but still the principle is there. Well, these pipelines are going to go across the borders. That doesn't sound very constructive. So that is an immediate danger. Secondly, and longer term, and coming to Dan, is the renewable sector. That has to be the growth area for energy going forward. So we're talking basically wind and solar. And all three countries have incentive systems. And incentive systems tend to feed into localization systems. Because once you provide some government incentive, the next thing which seems to follow is we're going to restrict the use of that incentive to local firms. So what that means is that feed-in tariffs, shouldn't apply for renewable energy produced, for example, in Canada, shipped to the United States. Subsidies for solar or wind or maybe other renewable energies might be developed in the future, tides and so forth. Well, they should only apply to the national stuff. And then on top of those problems, you'll have possibly additional problems of standards of what really constitutes renewable. It could be different between Mexico and Canada. And the United States. This is a very green field, very possible for constructive negotiation going forward. But right now, there are no rules, and if you just leave the situation to develop, it'll probably be the wrong rules. There's a small issue on rules of origin on Canadian oil. I'll leave that to the side. It's in our policy brief. Then there's the bigger issue of, if the U.S. presses too hard on some of these other points noted in that final bullet, clearly Canada and Mexico could, where will they retaliate? Well, there are two sectors, energy and agriculture. So, conclusions very brief. We should have full liberalization of trade, even for these sensitive renewable energy areas, which means if you're going to provide a subsidy, you do it for energy produced in Mexico or Canada, as well as energy produced in the U.S., which goes across the border. We should put these Buy American restrictions on the table in a way that we didn't quite do in NAFTA, but do it in a more fully way. And we should strengthen the legal basis for liberalization by trying to lock in Mexican obligations on liberalizing its own energy sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks to our four panelists, our speakers now turning into panelists as we go. Since Chad's hair has not gone on fire, I assume that the administration's negotiating goals have not yet been released. So I reiterate that those of you listening, or even after the administration goals are released, those of you listening to and reading our work have a very practical agenda. We just heard 4 versions of it for key aspects, not just about keeping trade open and supply chains, but about issues well beyond that politics has legitimately asked us to think about in a NAFTA context. We have a very great audience with us, as we saw during the first session. I'm going to, unless one of my colleagues wishes to say something about one of their colleagues, but I assume mutual assured destruction will apply. Let me turn it over to our audience for questions. In front is a traveling mic with Jessica. In the middle is a standing mic. Please identify yourself when posing a question and make it seem like a question. Yes, please.
Hello, Jennifer Hillman from Georgetown Law. My question, if I stand back and listen to what all of you have said, it sounds to me like really what you're advising is that we simply take the TPP and put it into the revised NAFTA. And as I think about what we heard even this morning, it was speed is of the essence, and it will be really important to try to get this NAFTA renegotiation done quickly. So for all of those reasons, that's what arguably makes the most sense, because it's no doubt going to be the ability to be the quickest. How do we do that in the face of Donald Trump's rhetoric about TPP? Is there a way to do this without Donald Trump having to acknowledge that it is, in fact, the TPP? Or is there a way, in essence, to repackage this so that you're not asking the Trump administration to simply say, we've changed our minds with respect to TPP?
TPP, remember, is the love that dare not speak its name. Although we should note, as I know Jennifer knows, that Wilbur Ross made a public statement that I think Fred and Monica referenced, that he would see some advantage in moving some of the TPP aspects into the negotiations. But anyway, who would like to comment? Please, Patrick.
I can start. Being from Canada, we don't have these issues. No, I think, look, certainly TPP, not in all cases, but in some cases, as I mentioned, for instance, in terms of e-commerce, the chapter can serve as the start of the negotiations. Of course, if you want to be very efficient and you just transpose it into a new revised NAFTA, and that's one chapter that's dealt with. Although, I'm sure there are many people who, well, there are people in the room and maybe more listening who are, have negotiated trade agreements. And as you know, where you start is not necessarily where you end. And it's not because, we take TPP and we use that as the beginning of negotiations, that actually that would be it. Given it's probably fairly easy to talk about a renegotiated NAFTA, modernized NAFTA in positive light, and certainly the discussion in the room has been that this would be good for the U.S. So the Trump administration could certainly sell a revised NAFTA in those terms, and doesn't really have to talk about the fact that when the negotiators sat down, they said, oh, well, instead of starting from a blank slate, let's use the TPP chapter. I think that's probably the politically expedient way of doing this, is saying, well, yes, we looked at agreements out there that the U.S. has signed, that other countries have signed, including Canada and Mexico, and we used best standards and improved on them. And here's what it is, even though probably, at the end, 75% of, let's say, the e-commerce chapter or even more could be very similar in both agreements. But nevertheless, the administration could claim that it's improved on those things, and in other terms, I don't think TPP is always necessarily the best example out there. Certainly in investment, there's a lot of language, as was mentioned by Daniel, in CETA that would address a lot of these issues. So maybe in that sense, it could be a blend, and in that sense, you kind of dilute the sort of negative publicity, I guess, that Trump has put on TPP, rather unfortunately.
Gary?
I don't think the greatest difficulty is the origins of these improvements from TPP. They can always conceal that. They're very skilled people in the administration, starting with Lighthizer. There are two greater difficulties. One are the multiple timelines within TPA, and when you stretch them out, as Chris Sands has done and Daniel Schwanen has done, you get well into 2018. And then you lock into the political timetable in Mexico and our own impending congressional election. So that to me is a major difficulty. And a second major difficulty is that there's no way Trump can accomplish the kind of objective set forth in his campaign rhetoric in any renegotiation. So his problem would be, if he has a reasonable renegotiation, that he will be outflanked on the populist left by some Democrats who say he wimped out, as they've already said he's done on China. So that kind of creates a problem in wrapping things up quickly.
Dan?
So I would just say to echo Gary, I think the problem is not where to find good provisions to fold into a renegotiated NAFTA. It's that the politics remain very difficult, if not intractable. And I do think this is a especially hard moment because one of the things that Donald Trump has done is broken away from the Republican orthodoxy of being pro-free trade for a very long time. And he is now joined with the Democratic left on that. So I think there's a challenge, and I don't think simply pulling some good provisions from other places, whether it's CETA or the TPP, is going to do enough. I think there's going to have to be a more fundamental commitment to worker dislocation issues. The U.S. has long underfunded trade adjustment assistance. We have taken economic theory a little too much for granted that somehow we would lift all boats with trade liberalization. It's not true. We have seen some groups have benefited and others have not, and we're going to have to be more serious about ensuring that the winners compensate the losers if there's going to be a political consensus to maintain free trade and to expand free trade reestablished in this country. And I think at the same moment, there's more to be done than in TPP with regard to things like protecting regulatory sovereignty. There's some starting points. There's some starting points in CETA, but I think it's going to require extracting a new and broader consensus on the fundamental point that trade liberalization cannot proceed on economic merits alone. It will have to take more seriously these other values, other concerns that Donald Trump scored a lot of points for calling out the fact that they had been underattended to in past negotiations.
Another question or comment? Please, Claude.
Claude Barfield, AEI. I think beyond the gauzy language on human rights and gender rights or whatever, the nub is going to be, I think, on labor rights. The United States has just lost an important case in terms of NAFTA, or not really NAFTA, but the CAFTA with the Guatemala. And there's been discussion on the Hill from the Democrats that the May 10th agreement is now out of date or it's not strong enough. I don't know what the Republicans on the Hill would say about that, but do you have any, just from Gary or from friends from Canada, how that's likely to play out? You may not know enough about U.S. internal politics, but that is where the fight, I think, is going to be.
Does anyone wish to comment?
I'll just say one word. I don't know anything about the internal politics, but from the administration, the idea, the economics of the idea seem really, really clear. That if you want to do something to help American workers, the way you do that, and especially vis-a-vis Mexico, is you make Mexican workers more expensive. And you make setting up shop in Mexico more expensive. And the way you do that is by improving Mexican labor standards and environmental standards. And they have not once, to my mind, grasped that and hooked onto that as a. So if they actually come out with these negotiating objectives and saying we're going to put a priority on labor and environment, there's economic logic to it. But I just have never seen them actually grasp onto that in terms of what they've talked about looking forward to a renegotiated NAFTA.
Okay, Gary, you? Oh. Okay, please.
Hi, question for Dan and.
Sorry, could you identify
Oh,
yourself?
I'm sorry, Raul Hinojosa, UCLA, spoke earlier. Question for Dan, and definitely acknowledge that the book that you did 25 years ago here at the Institute was very important for that moment. I'm wondering if you mentioned the North American Development Bank and the $7 billion on border infrastructure. Do you see, and you spoke about the reduction in emissions, do you speak specifically about how that closed the gap, which was at that point the issue, which was environmental problems along the U.S.-Mexican border, and has that, do you feel, been significantly addressed? And how does this notion of the successful institutional notion could be broadly more discussed? As you said, it should be in other environmental projects throughout North America.
So I would say that we've always got more to do on the environmental agenda, so it's never done. But if you recall again, and this is the core of the story on environment, where we were 25 years ago, there was a tremendous stress being put on the environment by the maquiladora industries that had grown up on the Mexican border. Mexico was under-attentive to the pollution coming from those facilities, to the toxic waste being managed going through those facilities, to the economic development of people moving to work in those facilities. And I think the NAFTA border infrastructure commitment was real and has helped to mitigate those issues. Again, not eliminate them, but improve them. I think there have been as well, and we haven't quite gotten into the full scope of this, a number of industries where there's now North American co-production that's fundamental to the competitiveness of certain industries in the global economy. And the automotive industry would be number one. And we see a tremendous amount of growth in auto production in Mexico. A lot of it is linked to production in Canada and the United States. And I've visited a number of those facilities, and they are state-of-the-art. They are outstanding from a pollution control point of view. So I think there has been some transfer of knowledge and environmental management capacity, particularly not just through the EPA government links to Mexico, but in the private sector connections, particularly the multinational corporations bringing their best practices to bear. Again, more to be done always, but still an impressive story that has perhaps not been told, and this maybe goes to the core question of the day. Any attempt to bring a new NAFTA out of this administration needs to have a fundamental emphasis on some points that were not talked about. And this is one, that there has been environmental progress and that we should celebrate it. And I guess the other thing I would note about what worked and what didn't, looking back at 25 years of environmental efforts, what worked and what separates in my mind the NAD Bank, as it's called, and the BEC, the two border institutions from the CEC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, was that there was a funding mechanism attached to that border infrastructure effort. And I would tell you more broadly that one of the mistakes of 20th century environmental regulatory efforts was not to ask, where is the money going to come from for the things we need to do? So I think the idea that in the border context there was a focus on money, there was a funding mechanism, is now being learned. And we are starting to see a commitment to green banks across the states as a way to get that same flow of resources going to the kind of projects that need to be invested in. Clean energy projects, but environmental infrastructure more broadly. So there's lessons both positive and negative, and I think it's a pretty good story overall, but again, room for improvement.
Does anyone else want to comment? Nope. Okay, please.
Charles Bustani, Capital Counsel. Dan, I'd like you to elaborate more on what you think should be done with ISDS, but also one of the problems we had in moving forward with getting the votes to pass TPP after it was signed and agreed upon was the fact that there was a carve-out for tobacco advertising in the ISDS process. We lost 18 votes right there, which was the tipping point, which kept us from going forward. So do you believe there should be carve-outs in an ISDS process, in addition to, if you would, please elaborate a little further on it?
So I guess my sense is that the politics here are always challenging, and it's probably particularly challenging in the current moment. But I do think that there are starting points from the TPP that could be drawn forward, but a repackaging is going to have to be required. I mean, I do think the Obama administration was in a deep hole from the start on this because it did not have the centrist Democrats as a broad enough group to really be enthusiastic behind the deal. And I think the left flank of the Democratic Party, and including the left-center flank, became concerned at about the moment that this was potentially coming to a vote in the Congress. So I think there is going to have to be a retelling of the story around what has been done on the environment. And again, there are steps forward. The TPP reflected an improvement on wildlife protection, on a series of conservation efforts, on overfishing, a whole set of things that did not resonate. And it was not just with the kind of progressive side of the Democratic Party, it was with the environmental community. And past success on getting the environmental community, at least some parts of it, to support trade agreements was lost in the TPP process. There was kind of a uniform opposition. And I think that's, again, a bad political posture because it means the centrist, center-left Democrats won't come in behind the agreement. So I think more to do across labor rights, worker dislocation, income inequality, and environment might recast the structure of the politics in a way that would allow it to go forward at some point, if not in the coming year or two, perhaps in the next 3 or 4 years.
Let's have Patrick and then Gary.
Okay. On the ISDS question, I don't know the politics of the tobacco carve-out within TPP, but certainly my understanding is this was put in light of the, ISDS suit that was launched in Australia on tobacco, right? And we've seen the end result where there was a arbitration decision that basically went against Philip Morris International, and basically disclaiming saying that the whole thing was just bogus, and that in fact, the Australian government has the right to regulate. There was no discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess then this brings it to the question as to, well, should there be carve-outs in ISDS? I would probably know the better approach is to say, well, here's what's covered, here's what's legitimate. Here are, in a way, the rights that states have in terms of their regulatory sovereignty. And certainly I mentioned CETA earlier, where that was a big issue. One of the reasons why CETA was, in a way, the whole investment chapter and ISDS portion of it was revised very late in the game was because of opposition in Europe, especially among social democratic parties and civil society against these kinds of frivolous lawsuits, if you want, by multinational corporations. So the language was strengthened, and that's probably where we need to go, is to provide arbitrators who will be dealing with these cases to dismiss what might be considered frivolous cases. And in terms of preventing, as Daniel mentioned earlier, preventing governments from regulating whether questions of health, questions of environment, or even human rights for that matter, as opposed to saying, well, let's have a kind of positive list of things that are included or not included. I think it's much better to have these broader principles, and then hopefully have a system that will do its job, as it has in actually many cases, if we look at the end result.
Gary?
Well, I'm very much in sympathy with the kind of environmental upgrading which Dan spoke of, and also the labor issues which were referenced briefly with respect to the Guatemala case. However, no matter what is done on environment or labor, I don't think you're going to get the Sierra Club or AFL-CIO to support the new NAFTA. For ISDS, if you junk it, which some people have urged, or really gut it, you will lose the business community. So that doesn't make any sense to me as if you want to go forward with a new NAFTA. And I conclude that the best model at this point, and I'm surprised Patrick didn't mention, is what Canada and Europe have done within the CETA. I won't go into the details, but I think that is a reasonable upgrading which the business community here could live with.
Dan?
I just want to add one quick thought, and that is, again, in part around selling any new package. The U.S. has not paid out claims from investor-state disputes. Canada and Mexico have both settled cases and lost cases and paid out. I think it's now about $170 million in the case of Canada and $200 million in U.S. dollar equivalent in the case of Mexico. But the U.S. has not been paying out, and I think that point hasn't been stressed. So the U.S. has not suffered regulatory sovereignty losses in a practical way, and this is one more example of where I think the facts have not been presented in a way that is actually compelling, if presented at all. And second, I like Patrick's point. I am not in favor of carve-outs. I think that's an awkward way to do this, but I think clarifying principles so as to be more clear on the scope of regulatory sovereignty. And I would add, in addition to CETA as a model, U.S. takings law might also provide a model. There are principles that have evolved in what we call the jurisprudence of takings cases that limit when a government action, a regulatory action, could be considered so intrusive on the rights of a particular company that compensation has to be paid. The general principle is the government can take regulatory actions consistent with legitimate public health or environmental or public safety needs and not pay compensation so long as those provisions are non-discriminatory, provided broadly, not aimed at a particular company.
Okay, thank you. We've reached the end of today's session. I'll ask you to recognize our four outstanding panelists in a moment. All the joking about what's come over the Twitter feed or not, Congress and the American public ultimately can determine what the negotiating goals of the U.S. administration will be. And I am grateful to all my colleagues, edited and led by Fred Bergston and Monica Debola, for setting out what a positive renegotiation for NAFTA would look like, why it would be win-win, what is practically achievable, and what, frankly, within reason, should be politically saleable. There is a path forward for NAFTA, and it is one we should take. Thank you very much.